represent the government of Colombia in this important event. Although Colombia is not always associated with Antarctica, it has a closer connection to the white continent that many others realize. Antarctic matters have acquired great importance in our international agenda, not only because of the worldwide effects of climate change and global warming, but also because of other geostrategic aspects. The research is vital considering that Colombian, Caribbean, and Pacific Oceans waters behavior could be linked to the phenomena occurring in Antarctica. The Colombian Antarctic Program, coordinated by the Colombian Ocean Commission, aims to guide actions in Antarctica towards research, protection, preservation, while maintaining peace in the white continent through international cooperation, technical transfer, and exchange of scientific information. For example, as Colombians have the privilege to have humpback whales give birth in our Pacific coast, this is a magnificent event that we cherish year after year, and we acknowledge our responsibility in their protection. As seasons change, they then begin their long journey to the Pacific Ocean to Antarctica for the summer. It is to research these fantastic creatures further, as well as other phenomena, that we aim to continue to work closely with New Zealand. We are keen to work towards minimizing our negative impact on their environmental and protect all species. We look forward to having our scientific base to investigate further and analyze interconnections between the white continent and our oceans. We are thrilled that this event is happening. We see this as an essential part of our bilateral relationship with New Zealand. We look forward to working closely with institutions like the Antarctic Research Institute of the University of Victoria to investigate and protect Antarctica's wonderful continent. I hope this is the first of many events to share our research outcomes and contributions to climate change mitigation. I want to thank Professor McKay, Dr. Matthew O'Maher, and for having us here in Wellington, of course, and Ángela Posada Swafford for sharing her experiences and science journalism, and our Consul-General in Auckland, Juliana Pungilupi, for helping us to put together this incredible event. Again, welcome, and Juliana, back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mejia. As the General Consul of Colombia in Auckland, it is an honor to welcome you all to this event. We are all thrilled to host it together with the Cape and the Antarctica Research Institute of the University of Victoria. Colombia takes seriously the white continent and our connections to it. I personally have dived with the humpbacks that make their way up each year from Antarctica to the Pacific coast of Colombia and wondered both at their journey and the place they have traveled from. We cherish this part of the world. Colombia too is a land of ice and fire. On a clear day, it is possible to climb the Cordillera in Bogota and see off in the distance snow-covered volcanoes. The Andes run through the middle of our country, and we understand the fragility of the ecosystems that they support, as we have watched our glaciers shrink year by year, so that in the case of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the world's highest coastal range, they have all but disappeared. Colombia has 20% of the world's bird species, including some that migrate from the poles to the warm tropics. What happens in the Antarctica will have a direct impact on their chances of survival. We understand Antarctica's significance for climate change and the impact of climate change on it, and we are committed to its preservation. We aim at continue building our research capacity and to enhance our governance and to adhere to the highest international and conservation standards. We are close to meeting the requirements for the establishment of our own base. We won't take shortcuts. The Antarctica deserves our respect. We are also looking forward to sharing the results of our endeavors and working with the global community, particularly New Zealand, to address the conservation issues that they raise. Lastly, here in Wellington, we would like to take the opportunity to congratulate the Government of New Zealand for its contribution to assessing the effects of climate change in Antarctica, including raising temperatures and increasing snowmelt and ice loss. It would be an honor to strengthen cooperation in these matters. As Ambassador Mejia said, we really hope that this is the first event of many of its kind. Welcome you all.
Thank you. My name's Matthew Omar. I'm the director of the Latin America Cape, your co-host this morning, excuse me. I have 2 or 3 things to do in my role. One is to explain to everyone here in the room and online that we have a mixed audience. Indeed, we have people, this is both an in-person event and a virtual event. We have people attending in the room here in Victoria University of Wellington, and we have people checking in virtually. So that means that when we come to Q&A at the end of this session, we'll be actually handling questions in 2 ways, from people in the room, and Juliana and I can look out and see who has a question, but we'll also be monitoring the Q&A function for those who are attending virtually. So please register your interest in both ways. For those who are in person, I have to advise, because we're in Wellington, safety procedures, the evacuation procedures is to the right of the room in the car park. My second task today is to explain why the Latin America Cape is co-hosting this event. We are doing so because our mission is to prepare more New Zealanders to engage and do business with the countries of Latin America. We're based here at Victoria University of Wellington, but we're backed by a consortium which also includes 3 other universities, Auckland, Waikato and Otago, all of which have the mission to enhance the capability of New Zealanders to engage with the Asia Pacific region and unlock academic knowledge. That's why we're in universities. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of all the Victoria University academics today, my good colleague, Professor James Rennick, eminent climate change scientist, and other colleagues from the Antarctic Research Centre and the broader Faculty of Science. So how does our Cape try and encourage interest in Latin America? It's partly through events like this. We do new activity and we do connecting activity. The new activity, we've done quite a lot with Colombia, for instance. I need to point out that we've done a variety of activities specifically focused on Colombia. We've sent cultural interns there. We've sent high school entrepreneurs there. We've enhanced the visit of a Colombian artist to the Quebec Brewster Gallery in New Plymouth. Next year, the start of next year, we're going to launch a lot of activity which is specifically focused on Colombia or partly focused on Colombia, market perceptions research into Colombian consumers, a musicality project which got young New Zealand musicians connecting with Colombian composers, and regional security dialogues, which no doubt will be of interest to the ambassador. So we do new activity, but we also try and highlight existing and relatively unknown activity. What connects New Zealand and Latin America and is not promoted enough? And one of the obvious things is Antarctica. New Zealand and Latin American countries share an interest in Antarctica. So last year we sent a young student there, actually from Canterbury University, on an Antarctic city, a Gateway Cities project. And today we have a seminar looking at Colombia and Antarctica. So my third task, therefore, is to introduce our main speaker today for the seminar. Ángela Posada Swafford is a graduate of the University of Los Andes and has a master's in journalism from the University of Kansas. She was born in Bogota, but she has lived most of her life in Miami Beach. She was the first Hispanic to join the MIT and Harvard Joint Fellowship Program for Science Journalism And over the last 35 years, she's done a great deal in exploring, writing, documenting, and reporting about many of the world's wonders, including the Arctic Circle in Alaska, humpback whales in Antarctica, and Chile's Centre of Paranal. She has produced a variety of projects for well-known American media, NPR, the Boston Globe, Discovery Channel, Travel Channel, National Geographic, among others. She is also the author of The Adventures of Science, Juntos en la Aventura, a series of 8 science novels for young adults, adopted by Colombia and Costa Rica in their school curriculum. As you'll hear, she has been a member of almost all of Colombia's scientific expeditions to Antarctica. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ángela. Welcome and thank you for being the star of today's seminar.
Matthew, thank you so much. This is quite a humbling welcome. I say hi from Cali, but it is rainy. Thank you to Juliana, and thank you to all at the embassy. Yes, I've been really fortunate. It was actually Antarctica, those first expeditions to Antarctica, that really opened my eyes up to the fact that we need to get together scientifically wise to explore and to use each other's best forces to do something about climate change in Antarctica. Actually, my first trip was with the United States Antarctic Program to the South Pole. And this was back in 2004, 2005. And that's when I needed to get to Christchurch precisely to get my clothing and to get some of the training. So that was an amazing experience for me to see Christchurch and New Zealand for the first time. Then I rented a car and went around the South Island. And then back in 2009, I went back to New Zealand. I never imagined I could be so fortunate. I still need to get myself to Australia. But my hotel room was right in front of the Tipapa Tongarewa Museum. And that's when I saw a very important, to me at the time, researcher, Steve O'Shea. He is working with the colossal squid, and I was fortunate enough to see that exhibit, and that was associated with Antarctic cold water. So that inspired me to write one of the novels that Matthew just mentioned in that series, In Search of the Squid of the Abyss. And so the main adventure deals with a character that is quite similar to Dr. O'Shea. Anyway, so that was my first trip, was in 2004, and I was able to see Scott Base, because of course you land on Pegasus ice field in front of McMurdo, and Scott Base is right there. So we managed to go in and have some beers, and it was my first encounter with the New Zealand wonderful, iconic Antarctic service, of which I really think the world needs to learn a lot. Also, another parenthesis, I wanted to congratulate New Zealand because I know your country is really one of the bastions of international relations in terms of science diplomacy and scientific advisory to governments. So I have read a lot of how you guys really decided to make this a country-wide important thing. And we need in Colombia to learn a lot from you. So after that first trip in 2004, I wasn't fortunate enough to be invited again by the United States Antarctic Program to spend 2 months, this time on the other side of the continent, off the Antarctic Peninsula, in the station, the Palmer Research Station, which is a gorgeous small United States station. They have this program for science journalists, and they asked me, why don't you apply? And I ended up for 2 months traveling on their ships and working there. And then little did I imagine that just 2 years later, my own country, Colombia, decided to start going to Antarctica to do research. one of the Colombian Navy's top admirals. Actually, he was the top admiral at the time, Ernesto Duran, just called me out of the blue, and he told me, "You don't know me, but I want you to be an expedition member of the very first Colombian expedition to Antarctica." Needless to say, I almost fell to the ground. I could not imagine. I had no idea in my ignorance that Colombia had actually signed itself as a member of the Antarctic Treaty back in 1989. And then that in 1990, the Commission of Antarctic Affairs was created. And then finally, in 2012, the scientific agenda of Colombian Antarctica, which has like an oversight of 20 years. So it was lovely because it's what Admiral Duran told me, Angela, your job is to tell the Colombians, what is it that a tropical country more than 8,000 miles away or whatever, how many from Antarctica is gonna do there? What did we lose there? What are we gonna look for there? And so I had to make sure that the Colombians, or at least try to, via my reporting, that they would confront this thing for the first time. So it was lovely because I had to work, use history, use the science, use even psychology to explain what was it all about, Colombian Antarctica. In around 40 news articles that I wrote during the expedition. It was supposed to be like a 3-month expedition. It ended up being like 4 months because we were stuck at the Panama Canal. You know, when you are in an expedition, it's great. You know when you start, but you don't know where you return. And I love that. I love it, and it made me really proud for a lot of reasons. It made me really proud to discover, which I didn't know myself either, that Colombia built its own Antarctic ship. Actually, it's a Navy patrol vessel built out of a German model, but we built it to the last window in Colombia, adopting it to our own specifications for patrolling the Caribbean. But now the government wanted to take this wonderful ship down south. So it was interesting to see how the Navy had to convert this ship in some ways to be adapted to the cold. And also this is a patrol ship. So this really wasn't a scientific and oceanographic vessel, but the ingenuity of the Navy scientists was such that they cannibalized other ships that they had, oceanographic vessels, and they put some instruments on board and made them work. I don't know how they did it. It was wonderful. And they also invented this ship container, and put it in the back of the ship, in the stern. And the thing is just a whole complete laboratory. And it turns out it's a container ship. So it was beautiful how we tropical nations, we've never been to the ice before that way, and we were discovering everything. So as we were sailing down from Chile, from Colombia down to Chile, we were stopping in all these ports of all these nations that have Antarctic programs, Ecuador and Peru, and obviously Chile and Argentina. Well, that is obvious. But for me, it was incredible to discover and to learn from Ecuador and Peru, who have been to Antarctica 20 years before us, who have stations, who have ships. And that's when I began my exercise in these relations of the ice, international relations of the ice. We finally, we were received a lot of help from the Chileans. They were lovely. They are a little bit our big brothers in the ice. They taught us how to navigate the ice, this transparent roller ice that is so treacherous. Our sailors, who are wonderful in the Caribbean waters, they didn't know how to face these big masses of ice. And so the Chileans took us to their simulators, and it was a lovely relationship. And this is what Antarctica does. It has this way of uniting countries and we need to use that as long as we have that magical powder, as I call. So that was my first expedition with the Colombians. Then I had one more. Colombia has had a total of 7 expeditions to Antarctica. What we're doing is that we take our own ship 1 year, and the next year we send researchers to bases of countries that invite us. And so we do that, no? One time yes, one time not. But those expeditions have yielded quite a lot of interesting research, and now I kind of wanted to be a little bit more specific. I've been talking to some of the researchers at the Colombian Antarctic program, and I've asked them, give me things that you're doing that you think that maybe we can either do in common or be of global interest or in general of scientific interest to New Zealand. So I do remember in the 2 expeditions that I went with, we were of course tracking the marine mammals, the humpback whales, and dolphins and porpoises. Not just tracking them from just their movements, but also taking pieces of their skin, looking for bioaccumulation of mercury, specifically mercury, I think also perhaps other contaminants too. Assessing their population genetic status. What groups are these? Are they family? Are they not? We also followed some of the humpback whales via satellite, and we could actually see a mother and a calf just lingering around Antarctica, and we knew exactly where they had been and how long and whatever happened, and then how they came back. So that was lovely to see that tracking of those animals. We also this is a beautiful study right now going on, is also the bioaccumulation of mercury in elephant seals in the Antarctic Peninsula and in some of the islands of the South Shetland. I think it's so interesting just to think, because wombats also migrate around New Zealand. So I keep thinking, why not a program that compares these 2 things? Because after all, everything about science, environmental science, even more related to Antarctica, should be based on comparisons, comparative studies. So another thing that the Colombians are looking at is the declining of the krill population and how that is impacting humpback whales, and obviously everything that it means. The connectivity and comparisons also of zooplankton and phytoplankton, because these expeditions they do oceanographic stations. The minute we cross, actually before we cross the Panama Canal, they begin doing systematically this taking oceanographic data of temperatures and salinity, conductivity, and the amount of plankton and where in the column water it is. And it's interesting because they do those continuously, even along the Drake Passage, which, as you know, the Drake Passage is very violent. These waves can be incredibly tall, but sometimes they are really, really smooth. And I remember the first time we did an oceanographic station in the Drake Passage. That was quite an accomplishment. We were all very euphoric, very happy. So that can also, help understand, what's going on with the ocean currents, with the cold water masses that sink from Antarctica and go really deep, and then they go north, migrate north along the South American coast, and at some point they merge around the equator or probably beyond. What does that mean for the tropics and our fisheries and our climate and everything else? So this is incredible, because again, it's connections, teleconnections. How can the peninsula, then again, We are right there at a stone's throw from the Antarctic Peninsula, the hottest part of Antarctica, and the region that is heating the most. And it will be interesting to see how some organisms, which our scientists stress them out on purpose, make them be even hotter. How can those organisms adapt in the peninsula versus how those organisms are adapting in front of the Antarctic coast where New Zealand travels the most, of the Ross Sea. So in general, then there's other scientists just telling me, look, Angela, Antarctic diversity is being underestimated. We don't really know that much what is there. We think we need to assess where are the invasive species and where are the non-invasive species, and what does that mean in terms of climate change, of global warming. Maybe if we find new species that, or if we encounter species that have been wrongly classified, maybe we can find a way to use this as a way to declare another marine protected area. So the more species we find, perhaps we have the best ways to protect Antarctica. Not just that, one of our researchers, and I'm going to give his name because you probably know them in Wellington, Dr. Juan Armando Sanchez is a very, very well-known researcher here. He worked with the NIWA in Wellington. And he told me, the names with Diane Tracy and Michael Clark and Dennis Gordon. And what he did is that he's a marine biologist, and he was studying the soft corals, octocorals, that fishermen that people who were put on board fishing boats to observe. They were collecting these corals as they came up in the nets and brought them to New Zealand, and they are studying all these deep water soft corals that the paper that they wrote, I don't remember when, talks about the fact that the circumpolar Antarctic current has a lot to do with their diversity. And so that's a beautiful example of collaboration right there with New Zealand. We also have things that we do in oceanography, other than just studying the deep water masses and their salinity and what happens. There's a beautiful study that one of the researchers did in one of my expeditions. They put buoys in the Gerlache Strait, which is this beautiful body of water in between the Antarctic Peninsula and the South Shetland Islands. Actually, it's inside the peninsula. It is a very tranquil place, but this is where the big waves around Antarctica are born, one of the places where these waves are born. And they put these buoys to measure how these waves being born in Antarctica affect the Colombian Pacific coast. So this long train of waves have the possibility of creating a tsunami, of creating coastal erosion. And we don't really know anything about these waves, how they're born, etc. So that was a lovely study, which I also think it could be extended to work around the Pacific Ocean, because the ocean is like a communicating vessel. So I see a lot of potential there with New Zealand. We also did something I loved with the Navy. I say we because I was just there looking. They did this lovely thing. They did a lot of the mapping of the seafloor around the Gerlache Strait and the subantarctic islands, because with the warming of the melting of the ice, the coastline is changing a little bit, the ice part. So the ships, the tourism ships and other ships are getting really close to uncharted waters. As a consequence, you perhaps might remember, a few years ago, more than 2 or 3 or 4 ships were actually having, they just collided against they were half shipwrecked. So Colombia wanted to put its little grain of sand in the contribution of marine safety, marine navigation safety. And in cooperation with Chile, they pretty much filled a lot of holes in the nautical charts of those beautiful bays that are now full of tourists and more. And I was able to really attest to that years later, because my last trip to Antarctica was about 2 years ago as a tourist. I wanted to study the impact of tourism, of South American tourism, actually tourism coming out of South America. And I struck a deal with a tour company. And in talking to the captain, I was showing them photos of that new bathymetry, and he was delighted because he said, we still don't know a lot of the bottom of the ocean here. So that was a beautiful contribution. Then there is something else, and I think I'm gonna stop very soon to be able to talk to our next guest, to Robert. We're also doing studies in glaciology. We have researchers working not just in the Antarctic Peninsula in glaciers, but also in the Thwaites Glacier, which is this big, important glacier that has everybody so worried in Antarctica. He does that with international collaboration. We are mapping using drones to map the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula and islands, specifically mapping the green patches, because Antarctica, because of the warming, is becoming green. So we're mapping where all that green is, a green that didn't exist. And finally, yes, the Antarctic Polar Early Career Scientists is this beautiful organization. It's actually called APEX. It is this association that benefits and connects and helps young researchers interested in both, well, actually in Antarctica. And it is an international organization, and it has a chapter in Colombia. There are 59 members, and they are very active, and they engage in presentations. So I think there is a lot of room there to study. I'm just delighted to be able to open this window. Naturally, as I pass the pages, I forget that we also should engage in microplastic studies. And again, let's hope that you guys get a better view of what we do in Colombia. We are still relatively young at it, but we're doing it as solid as we can and as responsible as we can. And let's see what the future brings, to be able to have Antarctica, as the New Zealand program says, that we should have it as a valued, protected, and understood continent. So thank you so much, and let's see what happens. Matthew, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for a great, admirably clear and succinct presentation. I could comment on it, but it'd be far more value if we actually instead invite the next speaker to talk about it, because Associate Professor Rob McKay is Director of the Antarctic Research Centre here at Victoria University of Wellington. Rob is going to offer some general comments about international collaboration and responses to Angela's presentation. Just so for those of you who don't know him, his disciplines are sedimentology, stratigraphy, and paleoclimatology. He's been the representative of New Zealand, the Science Evaluation Panel of the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program, co-chief scientist on the International Ocean Discovery Program, chair of Australia and New Zealand IODP Consortium, Science Committee of the International Ocean Discovery Program, and here in New Zealand, he was awarded the Prime Minister's McDiarmid Emerging Scientist for a top emerging researcher at the start of the decade, 2011. So Rob, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, and gracias, Angela. It was a lot of ground that was covered there. I wrote down some notes earlier yesterday to sort of highlight some of those teleconnections and connections between Antarctica and Colombia, and you covered them beautifully. So I'll comment on a few of them and just also discuss some of the historical perspectives from a New Zealand perspective. We've obviously got over a century of connection to Antarctica in New Zealand. And so it's sort of drawing on some of the parallels about how a country with that long a legacy in Antarctica, what motivated us, why do we have that emotional connection with Antarctica and New Zealand? And why is this now suddenly a global imperative that every country in the world needs to actually understand what's happening in Antarctica and what the impacts in their climates are? And Angela, you talk beautifully about those teleconnections, how an equatorial country, actually it really does matter. I also really liked the way that you talked about how the Colombian program developed, because it's very similar to how New Zealand operated, several decades ago, about very limited resources, jumping onto the back of the big programs, particularly the US programs, but making the most out of it through ingenuity and being creative and using your resources very carefully. So we do run a very, very lean program in New Zealand. Financially, our program is effectively run at about $50 million over 7 years. So that's a very small amount of resource put into what is quite a high impact, globally recognized science program. And an example is actually where the Antarctic Research Centre came from. We've had an expedition down there every year since 1957. And unfortunately, this is the first year we don't have scientists going down to the ice because of the COVID cancellation of the field season. But our first 2 scientists were a couple of students that piggybacked down to Scott Base when it was being built with the Navy, and they ended up walking around the dry valleys and mapping that entire region. Just on the off chance that they could get on that ship, they basically hitched a lift down, and that's where it all started. And from that, the Antarctic Research Centre was established, became an established entity within the university in the early 70s, and has rapidly exploded in scope over the last few decades, as we've built in this very strong internationalization component of our program. So no one country, particularly the small countries, can do the scale of science that is needed to address this global problem of climate change, and particularly in Antarctica, consequences of sea level rise. Really great to hear that there is a strong, vibrant community of early career researchers in the APEX community within SCAR. 59 students enrolled in that in Colombia. That's fantastic. And so what I see as a really obvious, easy win to get a connection between our countries are student engagement in New Zealand projects. And also New Zealand is working with Colombian scientists understanding those teleconnections. So there's lots of opportunities there. I actually have spent a lot of time in South America. I unfortunately have never made it to Colombia. I've only been there as a gringo. I think I've been there once as a scientist to Argentina. I went there just finished up my master's degree, and I remember traveling around Peru, and every single farmer would tell me about the implications of that glacier melting up the mountain for them. And this is a time when in New Zealand, there was still denial about whether or not climate change was even real. So it really struck home with me that people working off the land instantly knew what they were facing in the next few decades. And it's something that, we have a lot of glacier research on the New Zealand glacier programs in our research centre. And here's a chance that maybe we could export some of our skills to understand monitoring of those glaciers. We've developed some quite unique capability there. I also want to point out a recent arrival to the Antarctic Research Centre. Just over the back here, we have Ángela Posada, who arrived this week. Has come from the UK, Southampton, but is originally from Chile. So is a biogeochemical modeler. So this means that what we're trying to do here is understand how Antarctic change affects the chemistry of the ocean, and then that will affect those biological systems. And we talked beautifully about those humpback whale migrations. Those waters that feed the whole coastline of South America are a function of what's happening in Antarctica. I was really interested in the wave comment that Angela mentioned. This idea that waves in Antarctica, the storms in Antarctica could create tsunamis in South America. And teleconnections are interesting, right? Because they work 2 ways. And what I'm interested in is actually you have a big subduction zone off South America. This is this big fault hazard of major earthquakes And that creates tsunamis in its own right. But those waves focus down towards Antarctica. And we actually think these long period waves that you mentioned are the type of processes that actually break up ice shelves. So there's been observations of big icebergs carving off the Ross ice shelf due to storms in Alaska. Right, so this is pretty big scale, it's almost instant connections. So it becomes increasingly apparent that we do have to think, even not just the equatorial regions, but also high latitudes in the northern hemisphere. So those are just observations on the talk, and I'll jump back to some of those connections between what I wrote down yesterday, not knowing what Angela was going to talk about, and then sort of make some connections into how we can see sort of common linkages there. So as I mentioned, New Zealand's been involved in Antarctica, not just since the International Geophysical Year in 1957 and the establishment of Scott Base, but our emotional connection is really born right back to the start of the century when we were still part of the British Empire. We were the staging post for all the great expeditions from Scott, Shackleton's first expedition. So there's a very strong emotional connection there. I live in Karori. I had lived on the back fence line to Karori Cemetery, and Harry McNeish, the person that built Shackleton's boat, the James Caird that rescued them to South Georgia Island, he's buried in my backyard basically. So we still have that strong emotional connection born out of a very, not just geographical location, but a geopolitical situation over 100 years ago. So geography, I argue now, as we talked about these teleconnections, doesn't matter so much. We're all connected geographically to Antarctica, physically, but obviously there's geopolitical movements as we've gone through time. The Antarctic Treaty is one of the sort of most groundbreaking initiatives on the planet ever, because it created this scientific reserve in Antarctica and banned military activity on the continent. So despite the fact that that was born during the period of the Cold War, and there were a lot of political tensions and a lot more, probably even more extreme geopolitical situations than today, there was a lot of scientific cooperation between those quite different ideologies globally. So the Russians and Americans, from what I understand from my predecessors, worked very collaboratively, and it's basically like the Cold War at a scientific level didn't exist. So some amazing work came out of those collaborations. So it's fantastic to see that Colombia had joined up in that in the late 80s and then have ambitions to really step up to the next level in the treaty. And that's something we certainly, we really do need, because we need to have as many voices in there to understand how the system is working and actually protect it. So you mentioned the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. That was born out of many decades of collaboration between the United States and New Zealand programs. Because Scott Base is co-located right next to McMurdo Station, we have a joint logistics pool. So just like your first expeditions to Antarctica, we piggyback a lot off those American transport and heavy lifting down to the Scott Base region. On a scientific level, and where I came into the picture was when I got involved in a big drilling project. The first drilling project to drill beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet and identify that it could collapse in climates that are similar to what we're going to in the future, 2 to 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century. We were the first people to identify that it did collapse the last time climate was like that. Now, we couldn't do that in the New Zealand program alone. It was about $20 million just to run that one project. But we had the capability to build that system. We had engineers working upstairs in this very building who designed this drill rig and did something no one else had ever done on the planet, but we had to use that international connections with the US, Italy, and Germany. So traditionally, we've always worked with that US program since the 1950s, but there's been geopolitical movements since then, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. So now we have an increasingly heavy amount of presence from other countries in the Ross Sea. Italy have a base, South Korea have a base, China are building a base in the Ross Sea. Those 3 countries all have their own icebreakers that go down there every year. And so we work with all those programs very proactively at a scientific level. Somewhat we divorce ourselves from the geopolitical side of things, because at a scientific level, we're still motivated by those same questions. How does the environment work? What are the impacts if we are down there exploiting it for resources, in particular fisheries? I mean, treaty bans other resources. So that's where having a strong scientific legacy really matters, because it gives you the mandate and the power in the international community to make things like marine protected areas happen. We have to have these observational data sets to actually back up that, that we can't over-exploit these resources. So the other connection we have is it's very obvious in New Zealand to say we have a connection physically to Antarctica. We always argue we lie at the interface between subtropical waters and Antarctic waters. And if Antarctica changes, we get more of a subtropical influence. And it's a simplification, but as we go into global warming, we start to see more of these marine heat waves working around our shores. So it does make a big difference. Invasive species coming in via the Tasman front from Australia. So it will affect our ecosystems, our fisheries, and those things. And so then, when I've mentioned to people I was going to talk about Colombia and Antarctica, I get a few skeptical looks about, again, exactly the same questions that were asked earlier. Why would an equatorial country be interested in this? And the most obvious one, and one that actually wasn't mentioned in the talk, but every country in the world that has coastline is going to be impacted by sea level rise. And so this is the easiest way to make a connection from Antarctica to the tropics. And Colombia has two coastlines, Pacific and Atlantic. And I would argue that Colombia has more to be concerned about than New Zealand at a very simple scientific level. And this is because for every centimetre of sea level rise that comes out of Antarctica, Colombia will actually receive more than New Zealand because sea level rise is not uniform. We all know we have tides, and tides are because the moon pulls the water around the planet. So you have a high tide when the moon's close to the Earth, and you have a low tide when it's further away. Antarctica is a massive ice that's the same circumference as the moon. So that actually pulls, it's sitting there permanently, so it's not moving like the moon, so it pulls water towards it. So sea level is higher in Antarctica than it is away from these big masses. So if you remove that mass as it melts, you suddenly get a low tide type situation next to Antarctica. Water drops because there's no longer that gravity pulling it towards it, and that water moves towards the northern hemisphere. So for every centimetre of global sea level rise averaged, roughly speaking, it'd be about 1.25 centimetres in Colombia, 0.75 in New Zealand. So there is actually an interest there. And it's a curiosity. It's a quirk that doesn't seem particularly obvious to many people, but that's why we try to understand which parts of the ice sheets are melting. And I was really pleased to see that you talked about the oceanic connection. You know, El Nino, La Nina. I have a slight addiction to a Colombian product. It's coffee. And, you know, precipitation La Nina, the coffee crops are at great risk to climate change. La Nina, El Nino cycles are driven by those cold waters that can migrate up the coastline of South America. So those waters originate in Antarctica. We try to understand those teleconnections. You change the salinity of those precursor water masses feeding those cold water systems, you're going to change the way that El Nino and La Nina may operate on decadal to longer timescales. We know how that works. I see Jim Renwick looking at me. He knows more about ENSO than I do, El Nino than I do. But we don't really know much about how that oceanic connection works. And we talked about how the ecosystems, you know, and the other important criteria for why does Colombia, you know, does Colombia have a right to work in Antarctica? And I asked, well, do you have penguins? Tienes pingüinos? Sí, just. So you get a few remnants of the Humboldt penguins coming up every now and then as a part of that. So that's a direct physical link that if you have humpback whales, yes, it's obvious, but you also have penguins. So, which is more you can say for the United States and Britain. So. See, on Wikipedia. Very, very rarely. So you get a few what they call vagrant penguins. So they occasionally, mostly go about as far north as the Galapagos, which is very close. Okay. So I'll leave it there. Just mention, yeah, I'd say the student opportunities are really the big opportunities, and that allows students to come down on our projects to Antarctica, develop capability that then can be brought back to the Colombian homeland. So a very exciting opportunity to follow up on. So
thank you, Rob. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. We have time for about 10 minutes of questions now. And as I say, we're going to be fielding questions from the floor or from virtually, digitally from the webinar. So my first question, is there anyone in the room here who has a question? Yes, please. And I will relay it to everyone so it can be recorded on the web. So if you could just keep it brief so I can remember it.
Got to go through some Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Gracias por la presentación y todo, and it was really, really interesting. I have a question for both the speakers. You mentioned that the operating environment constraints have changed this year, meaning some people can't get down to the ice. And considering COVID and other challenges, what opportunities are there for those international connections? You know, for instance, today we have the leader seminar, particularly in person. What other opportunities are there to build those connections to continue progressing?
Thank you for the question. For those attending online, it was from a representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in New Zealand. How do we continue international collaborations during this lockdown period? Thank you. And so, Angela, I'll ask that question for you first, and then Rob, if you may wish to comment too.
Yeah, that's a tough one. But I think we can do exactly what we're doing now. Don't you think, Robert? This is precisely how we should continue to strengthen the cooperation, is by getting to know what each other is doing and how can we help, and where our strength, individual strength lies of each nation to be able to put it to use in general. So far that's all we can do. We cannot just get down there like right now, but let's continue to make plans and to contact people with each other and to make sure people are aware of what we're doing, what we have, what we can offer, what are our needs and strengths.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, one of the key things is continuing that communication. That's why, you know, the journalism and the science outreach is so important, because we do know what the implications are in many aspects. Now, we don't have to go to Antarctica every year. I don't go every year, I go every 4 or 5 years. There's people in our group that do not go to Antarctica at all. They sit on computers and they do climate models. So the skill sets that other countries have, I mentioned the El Nino, La Nina, there might be people there that are specialists in that topic in Colombia that can model that, and we can start having collaborations about, well, what happens if we change this part of Antarctica? How does that affect your model? So those are the opportunities that exist. We don't all have to go into the field and whack a bit of ice off with an ice pick and then measure it. Like that those days are long gone. We're very diversified into a whole range of different approaches now.
And I should add, sorry for interjecting now, that we can also work via museums. There are museums that have lots of collections with organisms that they have brought from Antarctica ages ago, and nobody's looking at them because there's no time or nobody to do it. So we can also work through the collections in our museums.
Okay, questions are coming in online. One is, Angela, thank you for sharing your experience with us. And in your experience, what strategy or actions can we take to reduce the impact associated with global warming?
Well, I humbly have a motto that I keep telling everybody, and it is that knowledge is power. Just if we know, if we teach people, if we care to understand and to communicate that knowledge to all segments of society, easier said than done, but not impossible, we'll eventually learn what's good for us and what is not good for us. I mean, Jesus, I mean, we just have to communicate and to teach and to give each other opportunities to, again, strengthen what we can do best. We just, then the more we know, the more we'll be able to behave accordingly. I mean, you know, it's just simply, my answer is knowledge, and it is cooperation.
Okay, talking about cooperation, lovely segue into our next question. Do you see the two countries collaborating soon on scientific research? Rob, you might wish to answer this one too.
Robert, you might, because what I was mentioning is just pretty much echoing some of what I keep hearing here in Colombia. Is just choose specific projects and work on it. It will be great to have New Zealand researchers on board our ship, for example, one day, to come to the Antarctic Peninsula and to be able to compare what's going on in those waters and in those masses of ice vis-a-vis what's going on off Scott Base or in the Ross Sea. we need comparative studies, and this is where we can just put each other in each other's stations and boats and whatever, and universities and museums. What do you think, Robert?
Yeah, I agree. It's I've got a lot of experience in developing scientific collaborations, and it's usually done at the scientific level just by chance. You know, you sort of might meet at a poster at a conference, and you'll have a very similar interest or complementary interests. So it does be serendipitous like that sometimes. But I mentioned the student opportunities is a really good way to start building those connections. You know, and if you have a very strong program in Colombia in a certain discipline that may complement us, then that's a good way to sort of build those links together. So project collaborations are just as important as actually going physically down into the ice. So actually developing a skill set or a capability that's really important to the global community allows those connections to be made. In New Zealand, we built a niche around these geological past climates, and that's where our strength is globally. And so people come to us for that experience, but then we're trying to link it into these models and trying to understand what's the impacts for equatorial climates, and that's where maybe those links could be made. So it's about identifying strengths first, and then pathways to actually connect those two groups together.
I have a question which actually follows on nicely from that, I hope. That is, we're interested in potential to collaborate. What stops us collaborating more? Now, in the past, we could have said different cultural backgrounds. We could have said lack of Antarctic programs. But now we have these elements beginning to be in place. So what stops us collaborating more between New Zealand and Colombia, and how can we overcome that beyond the examples already mentioned, such as student exchanges?
I think perhaps we just need to be organized and practical and bring the things down from the clouds and stop saying tomorrow and just put ourselves an agenda and okay, I'll raise up my sleeves and let's do our homework. Who begins? Like, I wanted to create a first step again as a humble journalist that have been to all these places and have seen these wonderful people that need to connect each other. So here I have just at least created a list of those people in Colombia whom I know that are doing fabulous research that could be working in New Zealand. But okay, so everybody needs to chip in into the salad.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's you know, every time, you know, again, speaking from a scientist, I'm not as up to play with the governmental drivers. But sometimes there's a suspicion when it comes top down from, you know, we'll set up a government initiative to set up these Antarctic collaborations. And so at the scientific level, you wonder about motivations. And so I really just emphasize the point that was made earlier, is knowledge is power. Once we start getting the science together, we always realize actually that's what motivates us. It motivates us from a very scientific endeavor, curiosity-driven approach. And so those funding mechanisms to bring those groups together generally always work. We get into a room like this at say a SCAR conference, a Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, and we actually have bilateral workshops. So we've had workshops with the US, Italy, Germany, those in the past. Korea is a big one for us. So that's the way it generally works. You can put them on side meetings for these things and just put a little bit of resource into it to get the scientists working, and then we can come back with the what is the desire to maybe grow that, and what mechanisms do we need to allow that to really flourish. So it can be top down as well as bottom up, and I think both approaches really work well.
Thank you, Rob. We've got time for one question from the floor, and Professor Catherine Irons from our law school here at Victoria University of Wellington would like to ask that question.
So New Zealand has been doing it for a lot longer, and we spread it beyond science. We have, like we said, artists down in Antarctica, we've got lawyers working on legal issues. I did Antarctic legal issues for my law degree honours dissertation in the 80s, right? That was a minerals convention. I'm curious as to how much Colombia has done that. Have you got artists going down? I know your program's new, but do you have lawyers particularly working on Antarctic legal issues and things like that?
So very briefly for those attending online, the question was, has Colombia looked beyond science to other ways of collaboration, e.g. art or law?
Yeah, I was just last a few days ago talking to the Colombian Embassy in Ottawa, in Canada. And we were just exploring the idea of what, I mean, let's do the same thing with the Arctic. I mean, after all, recent studies show that the Arctic has a huge influence in Antarctica and vice versa. So yeah, the same goes both ways. And in a way, I think we should like follow the water in a way, just following the water from the Paramo system in the mountains of Colombia, where we have all this water forming up that will become rivers and will end up in the ocean and will end up in Antarctica and the Arctic. So in a way, we can band together to follow the water and the poles and the third pole, you know, the glaciers. Seems to me it's yeah, this is a dire situation. Also because I just heard a couple of days ago that the Wall Street was going to begin, I don't know, putting working with water in, you know, putting water in as it were gold.
Thank you, Angela. Gracias, Angela. Thank you, Rob, as well. And thank you for everyone who's attended. We are actually at time. Those who are attending the event in person here in the room are welcome to join us for refreshments afterwards. And I'm keen to get to know those of you who I haven't yet met, and I'm sure you're all keen to speak to Rob and to the Colombia's new Consul-General, Juliana, and Honorary Consul in Wellington, Peter Cullen. It's been a lovely event. I've learned a great deal myself, and I was always fascinated by maps as a kid, and Antarctica is very much on those maps for me as a unifying force. And so I think our challenge is to build on this and to create some of those links that we've floated here. And I think that there is enormous room to develop this with Colombia today, with Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina, all the countries of Latin America interested in Argentina. Really want to thank the Colombian Ambassador and the Colombian Consul-General for the idea of this webinar / in-person event. I think it's a really terrific initiative, and they're both relatively new to their roles, and I think they're going to make a tremendous difference to New Zealand's bilateral relationship, and indeed to New Zealand's wider relationship with Latin America. So thank you everyone who's attended. We will be sending a recording of the webinar to all of you in person or virtually shortly, so you'll be able to access this, and look forward to developing this conversation next year. Happy Christmas for those of you who are attending online, and we look forward to you at our next event. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.